Good, good, good. Hey, it's great to see you. Welcome to Thrive. We are beginning a new series today called Into It, moving from crowd into community. My name is Andrew. This is my wife, Katie. And we're super stoked for the new series. Did any of you guys have like family meetings ever growing up? Or do you guys currently, is that like a thing you do? How would you describe our current family meetings?
Well, they're very small, but they can kind of be interrupted by the youngest member.
Dax always disagrees with whatever we decide. That's our little one. We have family meetings. We try to work through kind of the stuff in our life, and we do like a little spouse sync where we're like, hey, what's happening this week? We had an issue a couple weeks ago where I was going to a movie premiere and Katie was going to a book club, and we recognized that nobody was planning to watch our son.
I think that was my fault.
And so we left him at home. No, I'm just kidding. We called somebody and we said, hey, would you watch our son? But that's the kind of stuff that happens when we don't meet together. We get all kind of our wires crossed.
Yeah.
This new series, and Katie's going to tell you a little bit about some of the overarching things, but this new series is kind of like a family meeting. But not like the Alesso family meetings when I was growing up. Because the family meetings when I was growing up usually meant that somebody in the family did something really bad and everyone had to be in trouble.
Broke the bunk bed.
Yeah, I threw a lot of people off that bunk bed. This is not like that. This is a really happy 5-week family meeting. We're going to be in a 5-week series in which we're going to be talking about what does it mean to be the community of God, and going from a crowd of people, a bunch of roommates, people who show up on a Sunday morning and don't really know each other. What does it look like to go from going our separate ways to actually being a community? And we're going to be doing kind of real talk about the health, sort of the state of the union, the state of Thrive, of who are we, where are we at, and where do we want to go. And there's 3 big things that we want to remember throughout the series.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about like the 3 S's you can kind of hang your hat on if you think of it. The first, do we have a slide for it? The strategy is the, right?
Yeah.
Staffing is the first. Oh my gosh, I'm terrible at this. This is my thing.
We needed a family meeting before this.
We needed a family meeting.
It's okay, he's going to pull them up on the screen. There's 3 S's. Yeah,
first, there's the strategy of like going forward. We have had a year of being Thrive, and we're going forward into this new year, and we want to think about what's next. And so, strategy. I was right. Strategies first. But basically, we want to just think about, okay, if we can dream, what are we going to dream of? Like, what could we be, and what could we do, and what could we become as a family? The next one is praying for new staff. God is doing stuff in Thrive and building out our leadership team, and it's really exciting. And so we want to talk about that and help you to be like, wait, who are these faces? I know these people. And then just even lastly, taking your next step as part of that strategy, as part of this new year and all that we're thinking about, we want to invite you to being involved in new ways and finding your specific piece in our purpose as people of God in this city. And so we just want to invite you into that. We want to let you know that that's kind of what we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks. And so those are the 3 S's. Now you know.
So we're going to talk more about those in a little bit. But as we jump into the start of the series and the start of the text today, we're just going to kind of open in prayer. And so would you go ahead and pray for us and pray for this next season?
Yeah, God, we just thank you so much. We come to you from all sorts of different places and all sorts of different backgrounds and even all sorts of just different mornings. And God, we just want to say to you that you are God, you are good, and we're grateful for you. We're grateful to be here. And I know I'm just personally grateful for all the people here and what they mean in my life. Pray that you would help us to focus, and no matter what our morning has been, no matter where we're coming from, God, we just pray that you would meet us here and that you would just focus our hearts on what you have to say to us. Help us to just be open to what you're doing. In your name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Hey, if you guys have a Bible, open up to Luke chapter 4. You can probably Google it if you can get service in here. Luke 4, we're going to be hanging out today. We're beginning our new series, Into It, moving from crowd to community, and we're going to be spending a lot of time in the book of Luke. We're going to start this week in Luke 4, and we're going to be kind of going not quite chapter by chapter, but we're basically going to be in Luke 4 to 10, who knew a bunch of people who knew him and traveled around in Christianity and converted to Christianity. And this story shows what Jesus was like and how he interacted with people. And Jesus had kind of a crazy day one day that we're going to learn about. Have you ever just had a wild, crazy day, like maybe like the one I mentioned a few minutes ago, where we got our wires crossed and we were going in a million different directions and we felt like we had a lot on our plates? I had a different day, actually. It was several weeks ago, and it was absolutely crazy. I was officiating the wedding for one of my OG best friends from the earlier, that's been my friend for a long time. And so I was officiating his wedding, and we had a Wednesday afternoon wedding rehearsal, which was, I don't know who would do that, but it was off. But I love him, so we were there. So in the morning, I was working out with my buddy in Chinatown, and then I was in meetings all morning, phone meetings, in-person meetings, and I drove to Santa Clarita, and I was running this wedding rehearsal, and I had to get to class. I was finishing up school, and I had a class in West LA that night, and I'm taking a call on the way to Santa Clarita, where I'm checking. We talked about we're going to have some new staffing. We'll tell you a little bit more about that later. I was checking with a reference, going through the canyons of Agua Dulce, and like trying to take notes while I'm driving through the canyons, and I almost died like 4 times. I get to the rehearsal, and we're doing everything there, and everybody's like catching up, and friends from people from out of town, and I'm like, all right, love you guys, peace, and I'm on the road again. I had a homework assignment that night, and I think I was doing voice to text to like complete my homework while I was driving, and I got to class like 30 minutes late, and I was printing on the way in, and then I got a class for 4 hours, and I got home, and it was like 11 o'clock at night, and I remember thinking as I slid into my couch, just trying to decompress and saying hi to Katie, I have to do all of this again tomorrow. You ever have that feeling? We just had a crazy long day, and it was like 14 hours nonstop, and you just start thinking about your life, and you go, like, when is it going to be different than this? And just that feeling of being overwhelmed by what's going on in your life. And maybe a couple days later, you take a break, and you get a day off, and you go, okay, maybe I was being a little dramatic. But in the moment, you feel like, oh my goodness, the heaviness of the world is on my shoulders. I'm so busy. I'm going a million directions. I'm spread thin. I don't feel like I'm doing anything in my life well. You want to know what's crazy about that is that you're not alone if you've ever felt that way. You're not the only one. And in fact, don't just take my word for it and my story, but actually, Jesus had a day like that. In fact, Jesus had a lot of days like that. And so we're going to look in Luke chapter 4, and we're going to see how Jesus dealt with it. And that, as we look at how Jesus faced the busyness and the burden and the stretch of life, we're going to begin to see a path forward for us as individuals, but also a path forward for us as a church. So, Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 36. Oh, by the way, as we jump into verse 36, the background of this is that in the morning, Jesus was in a synagogue. He was like a church service like this in Israel. And he gave a sermon, and in the middle of his sermon, a demon-possessed person started shouting crazy things at him. If any of you do that to me, I'm not going to be as nice as Jesus. I'm not going to know what to do. But he was preaching in the morning, and like people just started shouting like obscenities and demonic things at him. And Jesus is like a miracle worker, and so he was like, boom, and he took care of it. But it was just like I'm just saying, it was a hard morning. So he worked in the morning, and then he's staying with his buddy Simon Peter's family. He's in town, so he's not his own home. He's staying at their place, and so we're going to pick up sort of at the end of his work church ministry day as he goes home for the day. Verse 36 of chapter 4 of Luke. It says, all the people were amazed and said to each other, what words these are. With authority and power, he gives orders to impure spirits, and they come out. And reports about Jesus went out into every place in the surrounding region. And so, after this long day of teaching and controversy, it says, and he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever. Right? You ever have that happen where you spend a long day doing a lot of things and you get home and you're thinking like, oh, I'm going to rest, and you come home and all the dishes are dirty, or your partner's sick, or you've got to handle some issue, some business, you're not getting along with your roommate, or your kids have been just terrible all day and you've got to get involved, right? So it's that kind of situation where he has this long, crazy day. He gets to where he's staying. The person who's supposed to be hosting him has a fever. And so they appealed to him on her behalf. And so he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she rose and began to serve them. Now, it doesn't say why he did it. I imagine he was doing it because he loved her and he was trying to heal her. But the cynic, the sinner in me kind of thinks, like, dude, this has got to go away, right? Like, at the end of a long day, it's like, you don't get to be sick. I need somebody to help me, right? And so he heals her. Verse 40, now when the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. So all the controversy, because they heard about him casting out this demon in the morning, spread the news like wildfire. It went viral. It was everybody was retweeting it. And what happened was the whole town decides to show up at his doorstep at night and be like, hey, you're not done yet. We need you still. And so it says that it said all who were sick with various diseases in the entire town brought to him, and he took the time one by one, and he laid hands, Jesus, God in human form, doing miracles with the restraints of humanity, feeling the tiredness of the day, but with the dignity and the love and the miracles of heaven. He put his hand on each individual person and healed them. Verse 41, and demons also came out of many, crying, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they knew that he was the Christ. So this is really crazy. There's like some demonic crazy stuff going on. And it says the demon's strategy to stress out Jesus was to tell everybody he was God. Because if everybody kept finding out that he was God, they would just keep coming at him and coming at him and coming at him and coming at him. And he was like, for human possibility's sake, I need to go to sleep at some point. And so you got to stop telling people I'm God. That's crazy. Usually it's the church telling people Jesus is God. Here it's the enemy. Verse 42, and when it was day, he departed and went to a desolate place. You ever want to do that? Just get away. Get away from your job. Get away maybe even from some of your family or your favorite people. Maybe you just want to get away from the city. Maybe you just want to get away from the burdens or the normal rhythms. Jesus just wanted to be alone. And when he went there, it says the people sought him and came to him and would have kept him from leaving them. So it says even when he went and hid in the morning, the crowds just kept coming at him. So finally, verse 43, he said to them, look, I got to preach the good news of the kingdom of God to other towns as well. For I was sent for this purpose. And so he left the city he was in and he went to Judea. It tells us in verse 44. That is a wild weekend. We'll call that a ministry bender. He's preaching in the morning, crazy, spiritual miracles, demons shouting at him. He goes home. The family he's staying with, they're sick. He's getting knocks on the door all night long. Will you heal us? He wakes up in the morning. He goes to try to find his quiet time. He's like, can I just take a shower, please? And people are knocking on the bathroom door like, hey, no, you don't have time to take care of yourself. We need you right now. And I think this text shows us a few things about Jesus and crowds, and maybe a few things about us and the world that we live in. Here's the first thing. Jesus always draws a crowd. He's something to behold. All the people were amazed. All the people couldn't believe the things they saw from Jesus. All this stuff we're talking about, you're talking about demons and miracles and healing people, and some of you are coming today and you're like, man, what are we talking about here? This is crazy stuff. But that's the kind of things that happened around Jesus, because Jesus wasn't just any regular guy. Jesus was God's son. Jesus is God's son. And Jesus came to earth as God in human flesh. And it's really interesting because the book of Luke takes the time to focus on the humanity of Jesus. You see, sometimes we can have these wrong views of Jesus that aren't really from the Bible. And sometimes we have these views of Jesus that he's all God and no human. And we can't really feel like we relate to him. He feels far away. And other times we see him as just a human, but we don't understand his divinity, his godness. And so we don't follow him. But the scriptures paint this really unique picture that he's fully God and fully man. And it's like nothing else. There's nothing else to compare it to. There's nothing else to relate it to. Even in the pagan mythology of the old, right? They had people who were like half God and half man, like Hercules. Or we can think of people like Superman, right? Who's an alien, but he's weak to kryptonite. But Jesus is this really unique thing. He's one of us, and yet he's divine. And in his presence, crazy stuff happens. And sometimes it's stuff that we won't understand and we'll start having arguments about it. And other times it's stuff that'll draw us in and we'll want to know more. Sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's controversial, but it is unavoidable. So much so that Satan's strategy was to make him so famous that he had to use fake names at hotels to not end up on TMZ. And here's the thing. Jesus, we need to be careful not to cauterize him, right? We need to be careful not to tame Jesus and make him sort of this palatable, kind of like one of us. Jesus is transcendent, and yet he came close. He is something to behold. And so everywhere that the Jesus of the scriptures is proclaimed, there will be energy. There will be hype. There will be buzz. There will be excitement. There will be frustration and confusion and people trying to figure this out because it's not like anything else. And so Jesus always draws a crowd. Well, here's the second thing. Jesus has compassion on the crowd. After a long day, he heals Simon Peter's mom, and then literally the whole town comes. Can you imagine if you're like the 300th person, and it's like your 25th case of athlete's foot, and you're like, you know what? You can go home. That'd be me, right? We're done here. This is fine. Not if you have athlete's foot, I'm sorry, that's real suffering. But I'm just imagining him as people are coming with their stuff, right? And it says that he personally laid hands on and prayed for one at a time and healed every single person. And he didn't just care about their physical needs, he cared about their souls. And we read about the spiritual freedom people received as the spiritual torment people were experiencing. They were freed from that. So he cared for them physically, he cared for them spiritually, he looked them in the eye, he saw them as a person, he touched them one at a time and treated them with dignity and honor and respect. He took the time to do right by each person. And so even though there was a huge crowd, he saw the individuals. And this is so important. I want Thrive to be like that. I want Thrive to do right by every single person. Now some of you would think, okay, well then we need to be small, and so we can be intimate and we can know everybody's names. But the thing is that we want to care about everybody in the crowd, right? Because the numbers, people say, well, like a church shouldn't care about numbers. Well, I care about the number of people because every number has a name, right? And every name has a story. And so Jesus saw the whole crowd, saw that the need was so great and everybody was going through all their stuff. And yet he wanted to be able to do right by each person. And for us as a church, we want to be thinking about the need in our lives, in each individual lives, and we want to care about everything that everyone here is going through. But we also want to have a sense of the broader need and about the needs of all our neighbors around us. And I don't have to tell you that the need for hope and for joy and for love in our world, for healing, the need is very great. The need is very great. And all the crowds all around us, there are very, very great needs. And Jesus, his heart broke, and he cared individually for every single need. Which goes to my final point about the crowds, that Jesus was not content with the crowd. You see, Jesus' goals and his priorities, they were both deeper and wider. We read that Jesus wanted to take time to be alone. And Jesus cared deeply about his personal relationship with God. And so part of caring about the needs of the community was making sure that he was in the right spot, that he was in the right place, that his spirituality, his emotional and physical and spiritual health was in a right base, a right place to be able to help and serve others. He prioritized his own personal time with God. We see that throughout the scriptures, that he would break away to pray. He would break away to pray. He would break away from the crowds to pray always. We saw another way he was discontent with the crowd. The fact that he wanted to care for each individual one at a time, not to treat them like cattle or a bunch of just like chickens stuck in a cage together, right? But he wanted to treat each individual person with love. And then thirdly, the problem is he could have one big crowd, but then he said, what about all the other cities? If I'm in Capernaum, I can't be in Jerusalem. If I'm in Jerusalem, I can't be in Istanbul. If I'm in Istanbul, I can't be in, right, Los Angeles. And so Jesus had his eyes on something bigger. Jesus had a dream and a plan for how he was going to care for all the crowds in all the cities, in all the towns, in all the places, and in each crowd, each individual was going to be well loved, cared for, prayed for, healed, served. Jesus had his eyes on something bigger, something with more depth, and something that reached more people. Sometimes we think those are opposites, right? Maybe in a church, well, we can be a deep church where we really get to know each other and we build relationships. Or we can be an outreach church where we're always thinking about welcoming new people and loving and serving people outside these walls. But actually, Jesus had a plan and a commitment to both. And they weren't in competition with one another, but they went together. And so we want to be, how can we be that kind of a church that has deeply planted roots and solid, reliable relationships in our community, and yet is not inbred? We're not a bubble. We're not just doing our own thing, going deep and forgetting about, we're not a little holy huddle forgetting about the world around us, but we also have a broad impact and a broad reach and a multiplication. How can we be both? And so as we move into Luke chapter 5, we're going to see that Jesus is going to show us how to turn crowds into communities. And he's going to show us how to have an impact that is both deep and wide. And we're going to be talking about this for all the next coming weeks, but we're going to jump here into Luke chapter 5. And we're going to see how he starts it. And so we're going to have a few points. And the first one is this. He's going to call us, and it's going to start with the people of God. It's going to start with the people in his crowd who are following him, who are learning from him, who are sitting under his teaching. It's going to start with people like us. And he's going to call us out of the crowd into the community. Chapter 5, verse 1. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." So here's the first thing. Jesus modeled commitment to a higher purpose. Remember, we just read at the end of chapter 4, he said, "I can't just stay here in this one place, in this one town forever, because I want to preach the good news about God and his love and about his healing in every city." He goes, the purpose I'm here for is to reach every city. So then we go into the next chapter, and it says he was in one of these cities, and the crowds were so large, they were so amazing, they were so astonished by him, that as he was standing on the edge of the lake, the crowds were so much pushing in on him that he was getting pushed back into the water. They were pressing in on him. And just like when he was at home and everybody was coming in with a need and urging him, "Here's what we need from you, Jesus." In the same way here, people are coming, "Here's what we want from you. Here's what we want from you." And so strategically, he gets into the boat and he backs up into the water, and practically he has to do this. There's so many people on the shore that he's in the boat so they can all hear him preach. And he shares the message. He says, "I was here to bring the message. That's my primary mission, is to spread the message." And he goes from pushed around to living on purpose. Now, no, don't get me wrong. He never lost his purpose. He always cared about the individuals, and he was always ready to serve them. But he showed us something here. That he didn't let the demands of the crowd dictate the life he was going to live. He didn't allow all the voices around him to change why God had put him on earth. You see, Jesus modeled something really important here, that urgent is not the same as important. You understand what I mean by that? The difference between urgent and important? Urgent is the loudest need. Important is the need that has to be met. It's the priority. You see, sometimes we have these goals in life, these dreams in life, these things we want to do and get to, but there's things that come up, and they interrupt us, and they get in our way, and they scream at us, and they say, "Hey, you have to deal with me now." And they make us veer off course, and they get us sidetracked, they get us lost, wandering around in circles. And Jesus knew the purpose he was on earth for. And so even though the crowds were pressing in on him, even though the people were demanding things of him, he remained resolute. He knew why he was on earth. And he would not allow the voices of the crowd to change his calling. He would not allow the pressing in of the crowd to change his purpose. And Jesus' purpose was for the good of each person, but he didn't allow it to be co-opted or controlled by every person. And so, he gets in the boat, he preaches his message to the whole crowd so the whole crowd can hear, rather than a few people trying to get at him. And he serves the needs of many. He doesn't allow a few to get in the way of that. He doesn't allow a mob to rule the scene, but he takes charge, and he hears how we're going to do it, and he preaches from the boat. And then, this is really interesting, then he pushes away in the boat. He's in a boat with James and John and Simon Peter and probably Simon's brother Andrew and maybe a few others, fishermen, and they push out into the water. And he's going to show us our next point, that he's going to focus on his purpose by investing in leaders. But before we go on to that next point, I want to ask you, do you know what you're actually trying to accomplish in life? Do you know where you want to end up? Have you worked through your purpose on earth? Or are you just moving from one fire in life to the next, one adventure in life to the next? Jesus knew the story he wanted to write and the story he wanted to have at the end of his life. And so he worked his way backwards and said, this is what I need to do to get there. Have you thought through where you want to end up, what you want to accomplish, the story of your life, your priorities? Jesus knew what he was supposed to do, the things that only he could do. Nobody could have his quiet time alone with God for him. Nobody could share the message that God had given him to share. And for us, no one can be friends with God for you. No one can love your family for you. No one can come to church for you. There are probably things at your job that are your responsibility, but really the things in life that are essential, there's very few, huh? We talked about a couple weeks ago, the only things that last forever are God and people. Have you thought about what you're investing in, what you're working towards? Jesus modeled living on purpose instead of being pushed around. Have some of the cares and the distractions of this world gotten you off course of what you really want to be doing, what you really want to be accomplishing, the people you really want to be serving and loving? How would you even know? Or in the midst of the grind and the hustle, do you even take moments to breathe and to reflect, to enjoy what's going on and to take it all in? You know, there's no shortage of things that can take our time. There's always another work project, there's always another family commitment, there's always another birthday party, there's always another concert, there's always another vacation. There's always another thing to save up for, to buy, a new toy to play with. There's always a new relationship to start. And if you and I, if we don't decide how we're going to use and spend our time in our lives, other people will do it for us. And there were a lot of people who were perfectly willing to decide how Jesus would spend his time. But Jesus knew why he was on earth. He modeled that for us. And so here's how he prioritized his time, verse 2. And this is, or not verse 2, but my next point about how Jesus solved this issue. And something that I think is important for us as a church. If we're to be a healthy church, we have to understand this. You see, Jesus called leaders out of the crowd. He raised up leaders with a shared purpose. So he's on the boat with Simon and James and John, and he says, push out to the deep. Verse 5, Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boats to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. Now remember, we talked about this briefly, this scripture, a few weeks ago. And I talked about it from a totally different angle, a totally different perspective. And we talked about Peter and how Peter thought he was the expert in fishing because he was a fisherman. And he wasn't really ready to let Jesus have all of his life. But then when Jesus was so loving and gracious to him, Simon Peter was ready to trust Jesus with all of his life. But I want to zero in on something different this week. I want to point out the fact that Simon caught a lot of fish. He'd been fishing all night and he caught no fish. But when Jesus told him to put down his nets, he caught more fish than the whole boat could handle. And the boat began to sink because there was too many fish in the boat. And the nets began to break because there was too many fish in the nets. This is not an accident when Luke is telling this story. Why is he telling the story about the pressing crowds and then the story of the too many fish? Why is he telling the story of Jesus up all night healing people and they'll never let him get a moment of rest? And then he's saying there's more fish than the boat can hold. It's an analogy, it's a picture, it's a metaphor, it's a parable. It's meant to teach a lesson. It was an object lesson. And here's the point. Jesus said, there are so many people. there are so many people in this world, and there are so many needs, and if one person has to meet all the needs, it's too much. It's too much. He said, so what I'm going to do, not because Jesus couldn't do miracles and be in more than one place at once, or not because God couldn't just like megaphone from heaven, but to model for us how he wanted us to live. For Jesus, showing us what it meant to be a perfect human. This is why he did it this way. He meant to show us a lesson that one person can't meet the needs of the entire crowd. But, if, like Jesus, we begin to invest in a few and ask them to help carry the load, then many hands makes light work. You see, there are so many people, there are so many crowds, and Jesus' strategy was, I'm going to invest deeply, intimately, passionately, fully into a small group of people who are then going to invest deeply, passionately, excitedly in their small group of people. And if everybody is loving someone, then everybody gets loved. And so Jesus prioritized developing others to do the same. And so throughout the scriptures, and we're going to see this throughout Luke, and throughout, if you read any of the gospel accounts, you'll see this in all of them, that Jesus would preach to the crowds. He would gather big groups of people to come hear sermons. And they would hear stories of change, and they would see people's lives transformed in front of the crowd's eyes. But then he would always break away from the crowds and spend time with a small group of people that he would help work through all the tough stuff of life. And always, he sent them out to do the same. And so, verse 8, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and he said, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." He recognized that he wasn't worthy of Jesus when he thought he was better than Jesus. And Jesus does this miracles. And it says, for he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. But then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid, from now on you will fish for people." Jesus said to him, "You will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed. Jesus said, all the crowds that I care about, my plan to reach them is you. He showed Peter, just like the multitudes at your house the other night, that's how many fish are in the sea. There is so much work to be done. And so we're going to share the load. And on your own, you can't do it. Right? All night you were fishing and you caught nothing. But with me, you can do it. With the help and the power of God, you can be a part of the change in the world. And so what Jesus does is he says, I'm going to raise up, I'm going to call from the crowd people, and I'm going to invite them to share my purpose. To love the people, to have compassion on the crowds. At another point in the scriptures, it says Jesus looked out on the crowds and he had compassion on them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. They were weary and harassed. And so he said, pray that the Lord would send workers into the harvest. Friends, Jesus is inviting you to be a partner with him in the work he is doing in the world. To meet every single one of those needs. To put an individual hand of love and prayer on every person in the world. To show the face of God to a human, to love them well. He's inviting us. The final point, he invites us to move from a career to a calling. Simon's career was to find fish, but his calling was to find people. And here's the deal. What God would invite you to for your life, the purpose of being on earth, that actually doesn't change for any of us. To glorify God and to love people. That's the same for everyone. No, it's not like, my purpose is to wage wars or something. We all have a calling, we all have a role in loving God and loving people. We all have unique ways that we do that. We have unique careers, unique families, unique hobbies, unique relationships. And so each of us has to sort through, what is my part in this? But what God would invite us, what it means to be truly human, to really flourish on earth, to love God and to love people, it's the same for everyone. And so we all have the same purpose but unique callings. And the question is, how am I supposed to, how are you as an individual supposed to accomplish your purpose on earth? To love God and love people. Now, for Peter, that literally meant quitting his job and spending his whole life telling people about Jesus. That's not the only way to do it. Lots of people who followed Jesus didn't do that, and Jesus didn't ask them to do that. So it's not that, I guess you're telling me if I'm going to be godly, I have to be a pastor. I have to go I have to go become a monk and live in a monastery or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. It's not about quitting your job. It's not about losing your passions or who God made you to be. But it's resolving for yourself, how does what God is doing in the world intersect with who He made me to be? Where is the crossover? Where's the spot in the Venn diagram where both sections are there of the unique way that I've been made, and the experiences I have, and the passions I have, and the purpose of God in the world? How is my career a holy calling? And if it's not, what am I going to do about it? How is my family a holy calling? And if it's not, what am I going to do about it? And the world needs Christian artists and Christian scientists and Christian political leaders and Christian teachers and Christian thinkers and writers and Christian speakers and Christian listeners and Christian salespeople. Not people who check a box and argue about ideology, but people who bring God's love and wisdom into the space. People who make Jesus flesh in their realm. And so Jesus calls people out of the crowd to be community formers, to be creators of what God is doing in the world. To, as we sang earlier, make heaven here. And to be bold. To be bold in spaces where maybe it's not even wanted, to say, hey, can I pray for you? Or to be bold when somebody shares something hard in their life, not to say, hey, I have all the answers, but you know what? Maybe this is something we can learn, and we can journey together, and we can pray together, and we can go to church together if you'd be willing. You see, the calling for Peter to quit his job and become an apostle is not necessarily your calling, but the calling to be a fisher of men and women, the calling to bring God's love to people, that calling is universal. And I want to ask if perhaps you've been settling for a career or a certain financial goal, a certain dream about what your house or your life or your friendships would look like. You've been settling for a couple extra vacations, or for making a specific kind of art or hobby that really pleases you for a moment, and it's not bad stuff. It can be really good stuff. But perhaps you've been settling for some things that are less than your calling. Have you worked through your purpose? So at Thrive, we've tried to clarify our purpose for existing and our strategy for existing. We exist to help people follow Jesus, to make much of Jesus, to worship Jesus. And we've said that the way we're going to do that is to invite our neighbors to gather for worship, to experience God together as a crowd even, to belong, to have a sense of depth and togetherness and unity and people that I'm walking through life with and I'm working through stuff with. That we would contribute, that we're all in it together, that we're all doing our part. And then to empower others to do the same. So you can see on the card on your seat, part of what it means to thrive, we say, is to gather, belong, and contribute. That's how we get to be the family of God together. That if we all do these three things, we're going to thrive together. But for any individual to thrive, usually it takes a person empowering them to do so. To gather, you need to be invited. To belong, somebody often needs to include you. To contribute, somebody needs to invest in you. None of us gets anywhere by ourselves. And so we want to be a community where we gather faithfully, where we have real belonging relationships with one another, and where we each do our part, we contribute. And so one of the questions, and as we're talking about the state of our church, as we push forward as a community, I would ask you to consider, what's my level of commitment to this family? What's my level of buy-in to what God is doing in the world broadly, what he's doing in the world through me, but even what God is doing here? You know, I think I've told this story before, but one of the first times I went to church, when I really started going to church for myself, it was because I was told that there would be a really pretty girl there. And I was not above going to church to meet a pretty girl. And that's my story. Sometimes we wish that when we get to heaven we get to tell a different story. That's my story. There's a lot of other parts of the story. I can tell whatever version I want, but that's a key part of it. We all come for different reasons. And we come and we're sorting stuff out. And we're trying to figure out, where am I at with God himself? And sometimes where am I at with this church is kind of a related but kind of a different question, right? Because God's doing a lot of things in the world. It's not just us. But over time, we begin to clarify the why. Why am I here? What am I doing here? And my hope is that for these next several weeks, there would be a space for us to sort through that together, to have conversations, and not to be overwhelmed by the whole thing, but to say, hey, maybe I just need to take one step. Maybe for you that step is just to commit to being here regularly, to just having a spot on the calendar where you're regularly considering these things. That it's not, when I'm around, when it's convenient, but you know what, like, hey, I'm gonna be here. Maybe you're already there, and you gotta think, okay, what does it mean to like really belong and to have like a space where I'm growing with people and people are speaking into my life and we're reading the scripture together, and maybe it's joining a group. Or maybe you're doing those things and God's calling you to step into a leadership role, and that maybe that terrifies you. But maybe that's what God's doing. Let's pray. God, thank you for